Hi, my name's Jo Bradley. I work for Stormwater Shepherds. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but it's my daughter's wedding, so I will be busy elsewhere. I just wanted to run through a few slides to describe to you the document that we're working on to deliver guidance for the removal of nitrogen in residential developments using SuDS. So this is a partner document to the existing document on phosphorus capture on residential developments using SuDS, and we're working on this with Syria and Fareham Council and Natural England to create a duo of guidance documents that will help developers understand how to contribute to nutrient neutrality. So what the guidance document does is it gives you some background and introduction before it then goes on to describe how to deliver specific SuDS schemes. So part of the guidance starts with where does nitrogen come from. So we explain that on a residential development, nitrogen comes from animal waste and dog poo, domestic fertilisers on lawns and gardens, and particularly from grass clippings and fallen leaves falling onto the road surfaces and impermeable surfaces and then washing into the drainage network. There's also atmospheric deposition of nitrogen, which comes down from the sky. So those are the sources of nitrogen that we're trying to deal with when we're dealing with residential developments and SuDS. The reason the nitrogen document is slightly different to the phosphorus document is this image. Nitrogen cycling and nitrogen flux is incredibly complicated, and I'm no expert, but we've done a lot of reading at Syria and ourselves to understand these processes, and because of the complexity of them, we can't deliver a guidance document like we did for phosphorus that just says if you build a good tree pit, it will capture this much nitrogen, and if you build a good pond, it will capture this much nitrogen. Because of the complexity of these processes, that's impossible. These processes, aminification and denatrification and nitrification and release of nitrogen gases, they're all moving all the time. They depend on temperature, they depend on microorganic activity, they depend on fungal activity, they depend on oxygen levels, they depend on the weather, they depend on the organic matter content in the soil, and that's fluxing all the time. So when the plants are growing, they're assimilating nitrogen, but when the plants are dying, they're dropping organic matter onto the surface and potentially releasing nitrogen. When it's raining, you've got nitrogen coming down into the system. When the sun's shining, you haven't. So the processes are changing all the time. The variables that affect those processes are almost infinite, and it's impossible to say categorically this tree pit on this day will remove this much nitrogen. You just can't do it. It's much more difficult than it was for phosphorus, and so we don't. We rather than make up numbers, we didn't want to do that because there would be no certainty to those numbers. So we've moved away from that and we've said, okay, this is really complicated. We're going to simplify it. The other thing that's important to remember for the nitrogen document and indeed the phosphorus document is that we're looking at residential developments, but actually the picture is much bigger than that. So this is just a snapshot image. I know you can't read the text, but it doesn't matter. The point is nitrogen is coming from across the entire catchment. It's coming from farms, it's coming from cow manure, it's coming from wildlife, it's coming from vegetation, woodlands, grasslands, it's coming from the sky, it's coming from industrial activities, it's in road runoff, it's in sewage effluent. And so across a catchment, when you're developing your SuDS for your individual residential development, that's just one tiny part of the broader catchment. And so that, again, that nitrogen story is very complex, and trying to refine it down to a single figure for a single SuDS device is impossible. So the document is slightly different to the phosphorus document, and I just wanted to highlight the similarities and the differences. So in the phosphorus document and also in the nitrogen document, they are the same in as much as we introduce the topic, we describe the principles of nitrogen capture, and we describe the factors affecting that, soil depth, soil organic matter, things like that. And we talk about good design considerations, so SuDS devices with vegetation growing out of them that can be harvested at the end of the season, things like that that make the system more functional. So we describe those in broad terms. We also describe individual SuDS devices that can capture nitrogen, and we show you an image of each of those, and we describe how the processes within that device might work. And then we provide references so that if you're really interested, you can do more reading. It is a bit of a wormhole, I have to tell you. Stormwater treatment of nitrogen is something that can occupy a lot of your time if you allow it to. So beware the wormhole. But there is some really interesting international reading that you can do. But unlike the phosphorus document, what we have not done, we have not provided a percentage removal efficiency for each device. So we don't give you a list of devices and a list of percentage removal efficiencies, because we can't, because it's too complicated and we could never be certain of that figure. And so we haven't done that. We started off trying to do it and we concluded that we couldn't. So instead of that, we've provided options for how you might develop a SuDS management train, and then we've concluded that if you do one of the two options we describe and you design them well in accordance with the Serious SuDS manual, then you can have an assigned nitrogen removal figure for your entire SuDS management train. And I'll describe that a little bit more in a moment. So this is just an example of one of the sections of the document. So this is the section on bioretention zones, tree pits and rain gardens. And so it just describes what they are, why they work, and the factors that affect how well they work. So you've got a section like that for each of the SuDS devices that we might consider as part of a SuDS management train for nitrogen capture. And we've tried to include images and a little description of how they function. So then, after we've described, I think it's about 6 devices, we describe 2 options. So we say if you do one of these 2 options and you do them in accordance with the SuDS manual, then you can assign a nitrogen removal efficiency to the whole SuDS management train. So this is option 1. And option 1 is a pond or multiple ponds across a development, followed by bioremediation devices. So the pond will remove the particulate organic nitrogen, or at least it will capture the particulate organic nitrogen, and then the processes will start to take place within the pond. So you might have an anoxic zone where you get denitrification. You'll certainly have an aerobic zone where you'll get nitrification. You'll get assimilation of nitrogen into the plants around the pond and the organic matter within the pond, and you'll get sedimentation of particulate organic nitrogen. So the pond is the first level of treatment, and it delivers quite good treatment and removes some of the nitrogen. So the proposal in option 1 is that you have multiple small ponds across the development, and then those ponds overflow to the bottom of the development, where you might have a large bioremediation zone or a series of tree pits or a bioswale. And those devices provide that aerobic soil horizon, a good depth of nice organic, dark coloured organic soils where your microorganic activity takes place, your plants are growing, so assimilation into the plants take place, gasification occurs, so the nitrogen disappears off into the atmosphere, so you're offering opportunity for those other processes to occur. That's option 1. That turns SuDS on its head for the UK. Normally we would do it the other way around. I'll explain how you can do that in a minute. But that's, reading the American literature, that is the preferred route for delivering nitrogen capture and removal in SuDS schemes. It will be a shift for British developers to understand this need for multiple small ponds across the development, and they might not like it, but it is an option, and we've stuck it in there so people can consider it. Option 2 is more familiar, and this is probably, I think, going to be the preferred option for most developers. So option 2 allows you to have bioremediation devices, so tree pits, bioremediation zones, bioswales across the development like we always do, capturing the stormwater from small areas of housing or roads or impermeable play surfaces, things like that, and then treating again the nitrogen in those organic soil horizons. But because of the risk of that nitrogen, particularly nitrates, which are very soluble, passing down through the soil horizons and into the underlying groundwater, these devices need to be lined. Because we are talking only here in this document about residential developments in nitrogen sensitive catchments, which are designated as nutrient neutrality catchments for nitrogen, then in those situations, those bioremediation zones must be lined. It means that you're capturing the partially treated stormwater. You've only partially treated it at this point. It's gone through the soil horizons. You've had some assimilation of nitrogen into the plant growth. You've had some removal of particulate organic nitrogen in the soil horizons. You've got some gasification of the nitrogen gases off, but you have only partly treated that stormwater. So the bottom of your bioremediation device needs to be lined, and then the runoff that reaches that liner and passes forward goes down to the bottom of the development and goes into a pond. I apologise for that pond image. It was the only one I could find this morning, and it's not a great pond, but it is actually a SuDS pond in Hampshire, I think, somewhere near Waterlooville. So perhaps that's the sort of thing we'll expect. So this is option 2. I think it'll be the preferred option because it's something that our developers are more familiar with, but multiple small bioremediation zones around the development and then down to a pond at the bottom of the development. So again, you're getting an opportunity for all those different processes to take place to remove the nitrogen from the runoff. So the document, in fairness, we have tried to put a number in the document to help developers to do their nutrient neutrality calculations. And so we've said if you do option 1 or option 2, and if you do it in accordance with the Syria SuDS manual, so you get your hydraulic considerations correct and you design your devices in accordance with the design guidance, so they're big enough and they're maintained properly. If you do that, you can assume that that system, that SuDS management train, will capture and remove 30% of the nitrogen in the runoff as an average across the year. So that's the figure that you would use for your change of land use calculations in the nutrient neutrality methodology. So we have provided that number of 30%. Some developers will choose to use that. Some developers will want a bigger number. And that's fine. If they want to use a bigger number, they can do that, but they have to provide evidence. So if they want to say, well, actually, I'm going to use a stand filter like the image on the right, or I'm going to use a manufactured device like the image on the left, that's fine. Those devices work. They're readily and widely used in America, but they need to provide evidence to Natural England and the Planning Authority that they remove more nitrogen than 30%. Looking at these, but certainly those products on the left are available on the UK market, and so I think it's possible we'll see those sometimes, particularly on very tight sites where there isn't any space. Sand filters we don't see. I quite like sand filters. I like that image, and I think from an ecological point of view, having open areas of bare sand like that, pardon me, in residential areas would be good for bees and things. But it's not something we're familiar with. So we'll get 2 different types of developments. So we'll have developments that just go down what you might call the bog standard SuDS route, and they'll design it in accordance with the SuDS manual, and they'll claim 30% nitrogen capture and removal, and they'll use that in their change of land use calculations. Other developers may want to go, actually, I want to remove 80% of my nitrogen, and they'll have to prove that then to Natural England and to the Planning Authority with evidence and data. So we're not shutting the door on anything. We're just providing options to developers. So that's it. I'm sorry I'm not there to answer questions. Hopefully somebody else in the room might be able to answer some questions, but I can come back to a subsequent meeting and we can talk about this in more detail. But I just wanted to give you a little background as to how we've reached the position we've reached. And if you want to discuss it urgently or in detail, then feel free to contact me through one of these routes. Thank you very much and have a good meeting.